Okay, so today is going to be a lot of fun because today we're going to break some quilting rules so that we can sew an adorable quilt together in just 90 minutes. Yes, this whole baby quilt together in just 90 minutes. So my name is Fallon and today I'm going to be showing you how I put this whole quilt together in 90 minutes. And like I said, I did break a few quilt rules, so if you are really into following all the rules, into doing what the quilt police say, you may not like this video. But if you like to put quilts together fast, if you are new to quilting and aren't sure of all the rules but want to get a quilt finished, then you'll probably like following along with this video. So to start, what you'll need is a charm pack. This makes it very, very easy. And since we're breaking a few rules, it'll help you make sure that everything looks great together. Plus, these charm packs are super easy and a lot of fun to use. Plus, they are pretty cost effective. So in these charm packs, you will typically get about 42 charm squares that are 5 inches. They're all color coordinated and patterns all go together. They're a lot of fun to use. So because we're using a charm pack like this, we're going to be sewing 7 rows, and in each row you're going to have 6 of these squares. So it makes it really easy to follow. All I did was just mix these around a little bit because they tend to start with the lighter tones and go to the darker. It's not always the same in each charm pack, but if there are double prints, they're always next to each other. So the one thing I did do is kind of mix them up a little bit. But other than that, I just grabbed a square and went with it. So the first rule I broke is I didn't lay all these out first and rearrange them and make sure none of the patterns are touching or any of the same prints are together. You know, I just kind of went with it and sewed. And when my rows came together, you will notice there are some that are pretty close to each other, and I'm just okay with that. It helped me put it together pretty quickly. So after sewing my 7 rows together of 6 charms in each row, I moved on to pressing. So typically when I press a quilt like this where I have rows, I make sure that my first row is pressed in one direction and the next row is pressed in the other direction. Because I wasn't really paying attention to which row is going to go where, I just kind of grabbed one and sewed it on. When I pressed, I just pressed all of the seams in one direction and just went with it. And whichever way the row I grabbed made more sense, I didn't really pay attention to nesting the seams. I just sewed everything together, and it actually turned out really good. I was worried I may have too much bulk or my seams wouldn't match up, but I did get some pretty good points in some areas. So I think it worked out. Now, I'm not saying I'm going to do this on all of my quilts because some more complicated patterns, it is going to be very important for me to make sure my seams are pressed in a particular direction. But on this small quilt, it worked out really well. So after sewing all my rows together, I moved on to pressing the quilt again. So I have this seam now where like row 1 and row 2 met. I went ahead and pressed that so when I basted my quilt together, everything laid flat. I didn't have the perfect piece of fabric for this quilt, but I did have these 2 fabrics that kind of made an ombre look on the back, and I really like how it worked. And it kind of made the front fun too, where you can see that the binding slowly turned into another color. I loved how it worked out, so I did piece my backing together. For this size quilt, you probably would be able to use one nice piece of fabric, but since I didn't have something that worked, I put 2 pieces together. So I sewed these together, I pressed this seam as well, and then it was time to make my quilt sandwich. So I like to use a tabletop method for basting my quilts. I do have a video on my channel that I'll link in the description, as well as a blog post talking more in depth about how I do this. So I use the clamps and I lay my backing fabric down where the wrong side of the fabric is facing up, and then I use some basting spray on some batting and I spray one side and then place that down. And then I place my quilt top down on that face up using some basting spray as well. It goes pretty quick on the table. It gets a little trickier with bigger quilts, but you just kind of move it around a little bit and work through it slowly, and it works out really well, and it saves my knees. So after I got the quilt basted, I did some really quick quilting on the quilt. I just sewed a 1/4 inch seam along each side of the seam. A 1/4 inch top stitch, 1/4 inch quilting stitch, however you want to say it. I sewed a 1/4 inch away from all the seams and kind of made a nice box around everything, and it turned out really beautiful. It looks great on both sides of the quilt. Then the last thing to do was to trim around the quilt, because I am doing a self binding on this quilt. Making my own binding would have taken a little bit more time because I would have had to cut the strips, sew them together, and fold them to get the binding ready. Then I would have had to sew it to the back of the quilt and then flip it over to the front. So that takes a little more time. So on this quilt, I just trimmed 1 inch away from the top of the quilt, and then I folded the binding in and used some clips to hold it in place and just top stitched around it. Now I do want to point out that on this quilt, I used on my machine, I turned the stitch length up to a 3, and I used that same stitch around the binding. Now, I do want to point out that this binding method is not my favorite binding method. I do think the mitered corners are a little harder for me on this method. And also, I do want to point out that you do tend to see a lot more wear on the binding or you can end up seeing a lot more wear if you're having to wash the quilt a lot using this binding method along the edge, because you're not getting all those layers of fabric like you do when you sew the binding on using the strip method. So I just want to point that out, but you know, depending on what the quilt is being used for, I think it'll work out fine, and it is a lot quicker, definitely. So there is my 90-minute quilt. Let me know what you think in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. And if you are a beginner quilter, do you think this might be a little bit easier for you to try since you're not paying attention to placement of all of your quilt squares? It really does make a really cute patchwork quilt, and it takes a lot of stress out of it since you're not doing all the layouts and stressing over where all the little squares are. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I would really appreciate if you leave me a comment below and let me know what you think. So until the next video, bye.